Before you listen, if you enjoy the stories and want to hear more, then please consider subscribing. Most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please take this time to subscribe. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story and be the first to hear. You'll also be supporting me. Thank you. I've taken Ubers and Lyfts countless times over the years without incident, but I'll never forget this one Uber ride that left me completely shaken. It started normally enough. On a Saturday night, I requested a ride to meet up with some friends downtown at a bar. Within a few minutes, a driver named Tom accepted my request and he was on his way. When he pulled up, he seemed polite and benign at first. He asked how my night was going so far. Some light small talk like most Uber drivers. I noticed he looked to be in his late 40s or so. I didn't think much of it and got into the back seat. As we drove, I was gazing out the window when he suddenly said, "You look really nice tonight." I felt a bit uncomfortable with the unprompted comment, but just smiled politely and said thanks. A few minutes later, though, he added, "That dress really shows off your legs well." Instantly, alarm bells went off in my head and I tensed up. But I forced an uncomfortable laugh and didn't respond, hoping he'd take the hint to stop. But then he glanced back over his shoulder to the back seat and said in a sleazy tone, "Your boyfriend's a really lucky guy to get to see you looking this hot." I immediately tensed up, absolutely furious that this stranger was making assumptions about my relationship status and objectifying me. I tersely informed him that I preferred not to discuss my personal life and pointedly stared back out the passenger window, hoping he'd get the hint and drop it. But instead he just snickered under his breath, apparently amused by my visible discomfort. "No need to be so modest, just taking in the view," he said with a creepy grin. My skin crawled as I crossed my arms tightly across my chest and leaned against the door, putting as much distance between us as possible. I could see him leering at me in the rearview mirror, and it took every ounce of restraint not to scream at him to shut his vile mouth. But some instinct told me escalating the situation could make things worse, since he was the one driving. So I just continued staring silently up the window, watching downtown lights stream by and praying we were getting close to the bar soon so I could escape this nightmare ride. But the harassment didn't stop. "Gotta say, that dress fits you like a glove. Your body is banging, girl," he remarked, that same slimy grin on his face. I felt violated by his disgusting comments, but still refrained from engaging. I wanted to yell that he didn't have the right to degrade me this way, that his words were not compliments, no matter how much he pretended they were. But I knew I just needed to remain calm and get out of his car as soon as possible, so I just gazed quietly ahead, willing the vehicle to go faster. That's when he piped up again, saying in a casual tone, as if we were old friends, "Hey, no need to be shy, babe. I'm just being nice and giving you some compliments." At this point, I was steaming inside at this predator's audacity, but I still held my tongue, feeling utterly powerless trapped there at his mercy. At this point, I felt extremely unsafe and just wanted out of his car. As we stopped at a red light, I quickly texted my friend the situation, that my Uber driver was harassing me and his name was Tom. I wanted someone to know what was happening in case things escalated. That's when he suddenly hit a button up front to lock all the car doors from his controls. My heart plummeted into my stomach as a wave of terror washed over me. I angrily demanded he unlock the doors and let me out immediately. But he just chuckled softly and said, "Don't be like that, sweetie. We're having a nice chat." He even winked at me in the rearview mirror. I was livid and panicked. As the light turned green and he hit the gas, I frantically yanked at the door handles trying to get out, but the child's safety locks were clearly activated. My mind raced as I yelled for him to stop the car that instant and let me out, but he just grinned and said we were almost to my destination already. I knew I had to do something fast before this escalated any further. As he slowed for the next turn, I braced myself and then lunged between the two front seats towards the gear shift. He shrieked in surprise and swerved, but I managed to shift into park right as he slammed the brakes. Nearly hyperventilating, I scrambled out of the car and started sprinting down the street. I heard him angrily yell something after me but didn't look back. I ran several blocks, my heels in hand, until I reached a crowded restaurant. I ducked inside and furiously requested another Uber, almost in tears by now. Once I finally got home, I immediately called the police to report everything that had happened. Unfortunately, they said that since he didn't physically harm or touch me, It was difficult to prosecute just for vulgar comments alone. All I could really do was report him to Uber in hopes they would permanently ban him from driving. In the following weeks, I tried desperately to move past the traumatic event and not let completely shake my sense of security. But I was deeply disturbed recognizing how vulnerable I was in that situation, and it pains me to imagine other women who may have already endured worse at the hands of that predator. Ever since, whenever I get into an Uber or Lyft alone, I make sure to immediately check that the child locks can't be triggered from the front seat and that all the doors easily open from the inside. I also make sure to share my location and driver details with a friend. But even taking precautions, I still can't help but feel violated remembering what I experienced. I get filled with anger imagining what some other unsuspecting passengers have likely endured at the hands of that driver. I've taken countless Ubers over the years without any real issues. But I'll never forget the terrifying ride where my driver passed out mid-trip, nearly causing a tragic accident. It started normally. I requested an Uber downtown to meet up with friends at a restaurant. Within a few minutes, a driver named Frank accepted and arrived. He was probably in his 50s, greeted me politely, confirmed my destination. All very benign. We took off, making casual small talk about the weather and traffic. After about 5 minutes on the road, Frank suddenly said, "Wow, sorry. I'm feeling a little lightheaded and dizzy. I think my blood sugar is low." I asked with concern if he needed something from my purse, like fruit snacks or candy, to get his blood sugar up quickly. But he waved it off, saying he was probably just dehydrated since it was hot out. He assured me he'd be fine after finishing off his water bottle. I kept glancing over at him, still a bit worried. His driving seemed okay. He was staying in his lane and his speed was consistent. He didn't seem impaired yet, so I tried not to overly panic and just continued our light chat. But a few minutes later, I noticed Frank braking erratically, pumping the brakes rather than pressing smoothly. He was also drifting somewhat within our lane. He mumbled, "Actually, I'm really not feeling well at all," getting tunnel vision. Hearing that phrase sent alarm bells ringing in my head. I suggested very firmly that he pull over immediately so I could call an ambulance to come check his blood sugar. But he stubbornly insisted we were close to my destination already, and that he could make it without needing medical help. Against my better judgment, I didn't put my foot down and firmly demand we stop right there. Over the next block, though, his condition seemed to visibly deteriorate. He was heavily sweating now, eyes glassy and squinting. He kept reaching up to rub his forehead, as if trying to regain clear vision and concentration. I could hear his labored breathing, see his hands shaking. I anxiously begged him again to please pull over and let me get in some help. But he continued waving off my pleas, saying we were nearly there. Suddenly, I watched his eyes seem to roll back as he blacked out completely. His body went limp and lifeless just as we were entering an intersection. In a panicked reflex, I lunged forward between the seats and yanked the steering wheel, just narrowly missing a woman with a stroller who was crossing at the crosswalk. We careened into a lamppost on the corner. I quickly threw the car into park and jumped out. My heart raced as I shook the unconscious driver, shouting his name. He eventually came to, dazed. I called 911 as he assured me he'd be okay. Shaken, we waited for paramedics. At the hospital, doctors determined Frank had suffered a diabetic seizure from extremely low blood sugar. He hadn't eaten enough before driving and ignored warning signs. I realized how unbelievably lucky we were that I reacted in time. It sickens me to imagine the alternative. I felt grateful I had insisted on the ambulance despite his resistance. Frank recovered after an IV overnight, but the episode made me cautious about assuming all rideshare drivers are fit to drive. They can easily hide conditions or make mistakes that endanger passengers. Now, if a driver seems even slightly impaired, I speak up and suggest pulling over despite their objections. A bad rating or bruised ego isn't worth an accident. But the scariest truth is some show no warnings at all before blacking out. We put enormous faith in strangers through these apps, trusting they take proper care of themselves. Yet, as passengers, we're largely helpless if a hidden condition causes a catastrophe. The terror I felt seeing my oblivious driver lose control keeps me up some nights. It was a sobering reminder about the fragility of safety when entrusting our lives to random company contractors. Try as we might to minimize risks, as passengers we can only control so much. I'll forever be thankful that particular ride ended in a lamppost rather than tragedy, but it altered how I view ride shares. I don't take that blind trust for granted anymore after that wake-up call. In the following weeks, I found myself growing paranoid anytime I rode with a new driver. I'd scrutinize them for any slight sign of impairment. A blink that seemed too slow, a minor swerve, a hand trembling. Surely my overly cautious brain was exaggerating normal human variation into red flags. But I'd also pepper drivers with questions about their health and routines now. Passengers have a right to feel secure at reason. Most probably thought I was a bit eccentric. A few even got offended at my probbing. And honestly, were they going to confess they skipped meals or meds before driving if they actually did? Doubtful. I considered simply sticking to public transit or even cycling to avoid the uncertainty of relying on strangers again. But the convenience ultimately won out, and I managed to slightly temper my hypervigilance during each Uber ride. That is until a month later when I switched on the news to see Frank's face on screen. He had passed out while driving another passenger, this time crashing into a busy intersection. A 3-car pileup ensued, injuring 5, though miraculously no one died. My heart dropped into my stomach. This could just have easily been my incident, or worse, my grave. It cemented my anxiety about ever fully trusting these drivers again. If only the apps screened for medical issues as rigorously as they did criminal records and driving ability. Maybe we need passengers to start submitting health forms too, proving we've controlled chronic conditions. At least it would encourage more open discussion around safety, though considerable risks would still slip through. It had been a long day at work and I was exhausted. All I wanted to do was get home, put on comfy clothes, and veg out on the couch. When I finished up for the day, I requested an Uber on my phone to take me home. The driver pulled up just a few minutes later. He was younger, maybe early 30s, with kind of messy brown hair. I got in and greeted him, but was so tired I didn't feel much like making small talk. As he drove, I rested my head against the window, watching the city go by. When we got to my apartment, I grabbed my purse and jumped out, so eager to be home. I went straight up to my apartment. It wasn't until I went to text my roommate that I'll be home late that I realized my phone wasn't in my bag. My stomach dropped realizing I must have left my phone in the Uber. I frantically searched my purse again, pulling everything out piece by piece, but it definitely wasn't there. I racked my brain trying to remember the last time I saw it. I had texted my coworker when I left the office, so I knew I had it then. It must have slipped out of my bag and onto the seat when I got out. I immediately went to log in to find my iPhone on my laptop, but of course without my phone I couldn't get the verification code it would send. I tried using my iPad but ran into the same issue. I felt so helpless knowing there was a way to potentially track my phone, if only I could access it. In a moment of desperation, I dug out my old landline phone, realizing that was now my only mode of communication. I used it to try calling my cell repeatedly, but each time it just rang a few times before going to voicemail. The lack of response made my heart sink like my phone was already lost forever. Starting to panic, I called Uber support to report my lost phone. After navigating their annoying automated system, I finally reached an agent. I explained the situation in a rush, urging them to help me get in touch with the driver immediately. The rep said calmly that they would try contacting the driver, but that I'd have to wait and see if he responded. Feeling restless and anxious, I started pacing my apartment, wondering how I was going to function without my phone. It contained everything, like contacts, calendar, work emails, social media accounts, photos, not to mention wallets full of credit cards and personal info. What if someone with ill intentions found it? The possibilities made me feel sick. I watched the minutes tick by, growing more worried by the second. I contemplated going out to retrace my steps, but knew it was likely futile. After 40 agonizing minutes, my ancient buzzer suddenly rang, making me jump. When I answered, a male voice on the intercom said he was my Uber driver returning my lost phone. An enormous wave of relief washed over me. I excitedly buzzed him up right away, so grateful I would have my phone back unharmed. But when I opened the door, an icy chill ran through me. The man standing there was definitely not my driver from earlier. This man was older, maybe late 50s, with graying hair and a very scruffy, worn face. His clothes were disheveled, and he had a large, beat-up backpack on. I hesitated, unsure what to make of the situation. The man gave me an odd smile and extended his arm, slowly, my phone sitting in his dirty palm. Nervously, I took it, muttering a quick thank you while starting to close the door on him. But suddenly he reached out and stopped it with his hand. He peered at me intently with chilling pale blue eyes and said in a gravelly voice, "Jenna was very concerned about you." I froze, feeling all the color drain from my face. Jenna was my best friend who lived out of state. I hadn't spoken to her in weeks. Why would the strange man mention her name? Confused and scared, I stammered some response while willing him to leave. Sensing my fear, the man let out a raspy laugh and said not to worry, that Jenna had simply called and he wanted to return my phone promptly. His intensity was unnerving. He lingered a moment more before finally releasing his grip on my door and turning down the hallway. Jenna didn't get any weird vibes from him on the call, but hearing him mention her name when returning my phone gave me chills. I couldn't stop thinking about those intense eyes, staring straight at me as if peering into my soul. I decided to check the ride history in my Uber app to try and figure out what had happened. But strangely, there was no record anymore of my ride home. It had been completely erased. Now I was really freaked out. Who was that man, and how did he get my phone? Over the next couple weeks, paranoia started to take over. I swore I spotted that man's face in crowds or passing cars. Jenna said she felt like someone was watching her apartment back home too. It got so bad I couldn't sleep and jumped at every little sound. Deep down I knew it didn't make sense. That I was probably just spooked over nothing. But his eerie stare was burned into my mind. I finally decided to talk to a therapist who helped me realize I had fixated on this as a way to avoid dealing with anxiety in other parts of my life. Slowly, I started feeling better. Until one night, months later, I was heading out of a bar and went to request an Uber. A car pulled up just minutes later, and I jumped in, lost in thought. When I got out of my apartment, the driver called out to me, forgetting something. In his hand was my phone, and on his face, a familiar, chilling smile. My blood ran cold once again, seeing those intense eyes. He just said, "Be careful," and drove off into the night. Thanks for listening in. If you like these stories and want to hear more, then please subscribe and like and support this new channel. We have more stories for you to listen to.